Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. The battalion's only hope was a 27-year-old state champion with 0 confirmed kills. His rifle, bought by mail order, his commander called a toy. In the next 72 hours, this toy in the hands of one man would destroy 11 elite snipers and force the U.S. Army to rewrite its combat doctrines forever. It all came down to one moment, 9:17 a.m., January 22, 1943. Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away. Before you dive into this incredible story, do me a small favor if you haven't already. Click on the subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. An interesting journey into the past awaits us, where, truth be told, reality is sometimes stranger and more amazing than any fiction. And most importantly, be sure to right now, pause the video, and write in the comments where you are watching me from, what country you are from, and what city you are from. When George showed up with his Winchester Model 70, complete with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer wanted to know if it was for shooting deer or Germans. George simply explained it was for the Japanese. But they shipped out before the rifle arrived. George had to spend the entire voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their garrons while his own weapon sat in an Illinois warehouse. He requested it be forwarded via military mail, and 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked Fragile. Inside was the rifle he'd spent 2 years of his National Guard pay to buy. The rifle itself weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garand issued to every other soldier weighed 9.5 pounds but had no magnification. George's rifle was a bolt action with a 5-round capacity. The Garand was a semi-automatic with 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin or cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanakaw River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Gifu, a fortress defended by 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 brutal days. They lost 34 men with 279 wounded before finally taking the western slope on January 2nd. Through all of it, George had fired his Winchester in combat exactly 0 times. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated from Henderson Field and dug into the massive trees. Some were snipers, armed with scoped Arisaka Type 97s and 99s. They knew the jungle, and they knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis as he filled canteens. On the 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On the 21st, 3 more men died, one shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had already passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot, and he wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George simply stated his credentials. Illinois State Champion at 1,000 yards, 1939. He was just 23 years old, the youngest state champion in history, capable of shooting 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, And with his Lyman Alaskan scope, he could put 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. His commander gave him until morning to prove his rifle was up to the task. So George spent that entire night meticulously checking his rifle. The Winchester had been slathered in Cosmoline for the long sea voyage, so he cleaned it thoroughly. Again. He double-checked the scope mounts. Then he loaded 5 rounds of the .30-06 military ball ammunition he'd brought all the way from Tennessee, the very same cartridge the standard M1 Garand fired. As dawn broke on January 22nd, George settled into the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had taken just 3 days prior. The bunker offered a commanding view of the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese snipers were using the massive banyan trees in that area. Some of these trees soared 90 feet high with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could easily climb one before sunrise and remain hidden all day. George was completely on his own. No spotter, no radio man. He had only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammo on stripper clips. He got comfortable in the bunker and started scanning the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan only had 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but it was just enough to spot subtle movements in the branches that the naked eye would surely miss. The jungle was a constant hum of noise, birds, insects, the far-off rumble of artillery. But George had trained himself to filter it all out, to focus solely on movement. He scanned the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. Then, at 9:17 a.m., he saw it. A branch twitched. There was no wind, just a tiny, unnatural shift. It was 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards out. George held his breath and watched. The branch moved again. And then he saw the silhouette. A man in dark clothing nestled in a fork where 3 branches came together. The Japanese sniper was facing east, observing the supply trail George's battalion used. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for windage. He took control of his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was as smooth as glass, set at 3.5 pounds. He'd spent countless hours perfecting it back at Camp Perry before the war. This was the moment of truth. Could a civilian target rifle take down a man trained to kill him first? George gently squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, its report cracking through the jungle air. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper convulsed and then fell. He crashed down through the branches, his body tumbling 90 feet before hitting the ground near the base of the massive banyan tree. Without hesitation, George worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. He held his scope on the tree, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. He knew the sniper's partner had to be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was lurking somewhere in that tree or one nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyan trees. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men, and the jungle canopy cast shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was already moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George calmly reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Carey, except these targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet slammed into a sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. He rolled left, pressing himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter should have moved after taking the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate. But in a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38, in the 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. His orders were clear: be back in position by dawn. The morning of January 23rd broke with a heavy, tropical downpour that turned the jungle floor into a sea of mud, cutting visibility down to just 100 yards. From his bunker, George could only wait for the weather to break. The rain finally let up at 8:15 a.m., and by 8:45, visibility was good enough to get back to work. At 9:12 a.m., George spotted his first target. A Japanese sniper had used the cover of the rain to climb into position. A smart move. The sound would have masked his movements. This one had picked a tree 290 yards out, a longer shot than yesterday. Also smart, they were learning his capabilities. George adjusted for the distance and fired. The sniper fell. But this 6th kill provoked a response George hadn't anticipated. At 9:57 a.m., Japanese mortars started pounding the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position from his muzzle flash or the sound. The first rounds fell 40 yards short. The second salvo landed just 20 yards away. He knew the third would be a direct hit. George snatched his rifle and bolted, sprinting north along the tree line and diving into a shell crater. Just as the third salvo landed, the bunker he'd occupied moments before vanished in a storm of explosions and debris. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north, which provided good cover and a clear view. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew he was hunting them, and now they were hunting him right back. The dynamic had changed. This wasn't target practice anymore. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he got his 8th. This one had climbed 94 feet up a banyan tree. Great concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky as the sun's angle changed. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to pull him back after 9 straight hours. Morris wanted a count. George reported 8 confirmed kills in 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris assigned him to continue at dawn on January 24th. That night, as George cleaned his Winchester, he did the grim math. There had been 11 Japanese snipers in the groves. 8 were now dead, leaving 3. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived. And now they knew exactly what he looked like and the rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to get some sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up and just sat in his tent, rifle resting across his lap. The rain started up again at 4:15 a.m. By 5:30, it was coming down so hard that any dawn operations were officially delayed. George used this time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree, but somewhere the Japanese would never expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The spot offered great cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in to wait for the rain to stop. At 7:43 a.m., the downpour finally slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing the trees. At 8:17 on the morning of January 24th, he found him, sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree 190 yards out, but he was low, only 40 feet up. That was unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. That angle gave him a view down into the fronds, where he could just see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting these men for 3 days and had already killed 8. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them, unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and began scanning the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for the muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom, checking every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 painstaking minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. This Japanese sniper was in a perfect hide, concealed by branches and vines on 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree, and he was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait. Now George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. But if George fired at him, the sound would instantly reveal his actual position. The sniper would be gone before George could even work the bolt to chamber another round. But if he did nothing, the sniper would realize the fallen tree was empty and start hunting him. George decided to turn the bait back on them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, adjusted for the wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and plummeted from the tree. Instantly, George swung his rifle towards the banyan tree, 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot, turning toward the sound, and that turn would create movement. George saw it, a slight shift. The sniper was repositioning. George centered the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But now, anyone watching knew his position. He grabbed his rifle and ammo and ran, moving east along the rock line and diving into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 08:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore apart the rocks where he'd been just 6 seconds earlier, kicking up dust and stone. The firing lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60, then moved again, this time 100 yards east to a shell crater half filled with rainwater. He settled in, water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater's rim, and resumed scanning the trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 to go. This 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest. He had watched 10 comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, his rifle, his approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting. George scanned the jungle through his Lyman Alaskan scope, which made distant shapes visible but not identifiable. Every shadow could be a branch or a man. He had to study each one. At 09:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees at all. He was on the ground, moving towards him. George caught the movement in his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth, using the jungle floor, the ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover, crawling towards his last known position at the rocks. George stayed perfectly still in the watery crater, his Winchester already pressed against his shoulder. His breathing was steady, but his angle was all wrong. The rim of the crater completely blocked his view of the approaching sniper. To get a clear shot, George would have to raise his head, and that would expose him instantly. At 09:52, the Japanese sniper paused. He was now just 40 yards from the rocks. George watched him through the scope, seeing the enemy meticulously scan the rocks, hunting for any sign of movement. So George waited. He knew patience was the most crucial skill in a sniper's arsenal. The discipline to stay motionless, to let the minutes tick by, waiting for the perfect moment instead of forcing a bad shot. At 09:58, the enemy sniper started moving again. He crawled closer, 35 yards from the rocks, then 30, then 25. He was coming from the south, the exact same direction George had used to escape the machine gun fire. George instantly understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper must have witnessed the attack and knew George had fled east. Now he was methodically working his way along the most probable escape route, hunting George just as George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks, slipped into the machine gun nest, and sat up facing east, looking right where George was supposed to be. The sniper was now just 38 yards from George's real position, but he was facing the wrong way. His back was exposed. George had a perfect shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot, even without a scope. But George held his fire. This sniper had survived 10 grueling days of American operations. He'd outlasted 10 other snipers who were now dead because they'd made mistakes. This man, George knew, would not make a mistake. That position in the rocks was far too exposed. No veteran sniper would stay there for more than a few seconds. It had to be a trap, a bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper, but widened his focus, scanning the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned somewhere else, ready to cover it. Then, at 10:06, George found him. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, tucked behind a fallen tree trunk. This man wasn't moving. He was just watching, waiting, his rifle aimed right at the drainage ditch where George was supposed to be. There were 2 of them. It seemed the 11th sniper wasn't alone. Or maybe these were the last two, numbers 10 and 11, operating as a team. George knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't take out both men before they fired back. His bolt-action Winchester was too slow. Cycling the action between shots would give them just enough time to pinpoint his location. He needed a new plan. Slowly, George sank deeper into the murky water of the crater. He went under until only his eyes and the top of his head broke the surface, keeping his Winchester pointed up to prevent water from fouling the barrel. And then he waited. At 10:13 a.m., the Japanese soldier among the rocks stood up. After 10 minutes of staring at the empty ditch, he must have concluded George had moved on. He turned, signaling his partner behind a fallen tree. The two began moving east, parallel to each other, about 70 yards apart, conducting a sweep to flush George out. George didn't move a muscle. The two Japanese soldiers walked right past his crater, putting them between him and the tree line with their backs exposed. Like a ghost, George rose from the water. Silently, he brought the Winchester to his shoulder, water dripping from the barrel, his uniform, and his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, now just 42 yards away, and fired. The soldier crumpled. George worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and swung towards the second man. The soldier was already turning, but George was faster. He fired again. The second soldier fell. 11 shots over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans. But as he climbed out to retrieve his spent casings, a sound froze him. Voices. Japanese voices from the tree line, moving toward the bodies. He'd killed the snipers, but they hadn't been alone. George dropped back into the cold, muddy crater, submerging himself again until only his eyes were visible, holding the Winchester upright. The voices grew louder. At least 6 men. He heard branches snap, equipment rattle. This was infantry, a patrol or a recovery team. George held his breath and began to count. The voices stopped right at the first body, just 42 yards from his crater. He was close enough to hear them clearly, even without understanding a single word. Then the voices moved to the second body. The conversation continued, the tones growing more urgent. A moment later, they started moving again, not back toward the tree line, but straight for George's crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud, leading from the rocks right to him. George had been so careful about noise and movement, but he hadn't considered his tracks. He had 5 rounds in his Winchester and at least 6 Japanese soldiers closing in. Terrible odds for a bolt-action rifle. His options were simple: stay hidden and hope they miss him, or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25, then 20. Suddenly, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater's rim, looking directly down at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. Still submerged, George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. He could hear shouting now, more soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the sound, ran 20 yards, and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets slammed into the ground around the crater and his log. They were firing at movement, at sound, not at him specifically. George stayed low. He peered through his scope, saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead man and fired. The soldier dropped. The second one doved for cover. 2 rounds left. Then he heard more voices, this time from behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. The decision was made for him. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against semi-automatics. He had to break contact and get back to American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through the jungle undergrowth as vines caught his boots and branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him, bullets snapping past, striking trees, kicking up dirt. He ran for a full 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. The enemy wasn't giving chase. They were regrouping, tending to their dead. George checked his rifle. The stock was caked in mud, and water was still dripping from the barrel. He had just 2 rounds left, and no stripper clips to reload quickly. The clips were in his pack, somewhere back near that water-filled crater. At 10:47, George started moving again. He wasn't running, but walking, keeping low, using the terrain itself as cover as he headed northeast toward the American lines. The jungle fell silent. No voices, no movement. The only sounds were his own ragged breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. Finally, at 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. He was challenged by a Marine sentry, identified himself, and was led through. George walked straight to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief, and George gave it to him. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. It had taken 12 rounds to hit those 11 targets. Then came the firefight with the infantry. 3 more kills there, using 5 rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about his ammo situation. George confirmed he was down to his last 2 rounds. And the rifle? George said it was functional, but desperately needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris ordered George to clean his rifle and get some rest. No operations for him tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal, and intelligence believed the withdrawal would be complete within 2 weeks. George went back to his tent, field-stripped his Winchester, and spent 2 hours meticulously cleaning every single component with Cosmoline and gun oil. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out perfectly clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds. Then, at 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters, wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement? Excessive ammunition expenditure? Operating alone? Instead, he found Morris waiting with 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had just one question. Could George train other men to do what he had just done? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry replied that the division had 14 Springfield rifles with Erntel scopes, and he had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry tasked George with creating a sniper section, training the men, developing tactics, and clearing any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational zones. George accepted, but he laid down one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request, so George held on to his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with their Unertel scopes were handed over to the men George was about to train. The program began on January 27th, with George assembling 40 men at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, these men were expert marksmen, having qualified with iron sights at up to 500 yards, but none had any combat experience as snipers. Not one of them had ever killed a man from a concealed position. George started with the absolute fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, and reading the wind. The Springfield rifles, weighing 11 pounds with the Unertal scopes, were heavier than the Garand and heavier than George's Winchester. This weight made the rifles stable, but also tiring to hold for long periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely provided a perfect shooting position, so snipers had to adapt to the terrain and build stable platforms from whatever they could find. The range training lasted for 3 days. George had the men fire at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, and finally targets partially obscured by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, consisting of a shooter and a spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, his job being to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, they could switch roles, which kept both men proficient and prevented a single point of failure. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanakaw River. Intelligence reported small groups of Japanese soldiers still operating there. Not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter, Corporal Hayes, and they set up on high ground overlooking a known Japanese resupply trail. At 0720 hours, a Japanese soldier appeared on the path. Hayes confirmed the target through his binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for more targets, but none appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. They fired 7 shots, getting 6 kills, with only 1 miss due to the wind. The other 3 teams reported similar successes, bringing the day's total to 23 Japanese soldiers killed with 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued its deadly work through early February, and by the 9th they had amassed 74 kills. This was a conservative count, including only confirmed kills where a body could be physically observed. During this time, the Japanese evacuation sped up, with destroyers arriving at night to pull troops from Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's western tip. American forces pushed west to cut them off, but the Japanese fought an effective rearguard action. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating the soldiers covering these retreat routes. On February 7th, while operating near the Tonomoa River, George was shot by a Japanese rifleman. The bullet hit him in the left shoulder, the impact spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a courseman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle, missing bone, and major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned and sutured the wound. They told him he would recover but needed at least 3 weeks of rest with no combat. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital, and during that time the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance to find it empty. The campaign was over. In just 12 days of operations, George's sniper section had achieved 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly casualties. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war wasn't finished. While he recovered, orders came down from Pacific Command for a new, classified mission in Burma. The Army needed experienced combat officers, and George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case below deck, its Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operating deep behind Japanese lines. It was exactly the kind of mission where a marksman who could hit targets from 600 yards away would be invaluable. Their transport ship arrived in India on April 3rd. There, George and 200 other officers received their briefing. They were to form a new unit, 3,000 strong. While it didn't have an official name just yet, the men had already come up with their own. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. This unit would later be officially designated the 5037th Composite Unit in late 1943. But training had been underway since that April. They focused on long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and how to operate for extended periods without any supply lines. The concept was modeled after the British Chindits, small, highly mobile forces capable of operating deep behind enemy lines for long stretches of time. George found himself assigned to the 2nd Battalion. Officially, his role wasn't sniper. The Army didn't have formal sniper positions in its structure back then. So George was designated as a rifle platoon leader. But Colonel Ferry's glowing recommendation from Guadalcanal had preceded him. The battalion command knew exactly what George was capable of with a rifle in his hands. Training kicked off in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the core challenges were familiar: suffocating heat, crushing humidity, dense vegetation, and severely limited visibility. They all knew the Burma jungle would be even worse, with steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy who knew every inch of that ground. George knew he had to modify his equipment for the upcoming Burma mission. His Winchester Model 70 had served him well on Guadalcanal, but those were shorter operations with consistent resupply. Burma meant patrols lasting for weeks, trekking hundreds of miles through the jungle. Here, every single ounce mattered. He swapped out the Lyman Alaskan scope for a lighter Weaver 330, which offered a slightly higher 2.75 power magnification and shaved off about 2 ounces. He also replaced the heavy wooden stock with a lighter synthetic one. These modifications brought the rifle's weight down from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. It doesn't sound like much, but on a long patrol, humping a 60-pound pack, every ounce saved was a victory. In February 1944, Merrill's Marauders crossed into Burma. Their objective: push through northern Burma and seize the Myitkyina airfield, a critical hub for Allied supply routes into China. The area was held by about 4,000 Japanese troops. The Marauders' plan was to approach overland through treacherous terrain the Japanese believed was completely impassable for any large force. A brutal landscape of mountains, rivers, and dense jungle with no roads and only the faintest of trails. This force had to carry every single supply on their backs or with pack mules. They had no motorized transport, no artillery support, just their rifles, mortars, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion started their march on February 24th. The first week alone covered 83 miles of mountainous jungle. Men were collapsing from sheer exhaustion, and malaria cases climbed daily. The pack mules couldn't handle the terrain. Several had to be shot after breaking their legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had trekked 217 miles and had already engaged Japanese forces 12 times. These were small skirmishes, quick ambushes, and sharp firefights followed by a rapid retreat. The marauders weren't meant to hold ground. Their purpose was to move, to harass, to cut supply lines and create utter chaos behind enemy positions. On that march, George used his Winchester 3 times. Once at 412 yards, taking out a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Another time at 380 yards against a machine gun nest. And once at 290 yards against a sniper who had a marauder patrol pinned down. 3 shots, 3 kills. George made it a rule to never fire more than once per engagement. The sound of the Winchester was distinct, very different from a Garand's sharp crack. One shot gave away his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to zero in on him. So George learned to shoot and immediately move. The entire march to Myitkyina took 3 long months. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost far more men to disease than to combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. On May 17th, the marauders captured the Myitkyina airfield. While the operation was a success, the cost was staggering. The unit was now combat ineffective, with too many casualties, too many sick, and far too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George made it through the Burma campaign. His Winchester did too, but the rifle that proved so deadly on Guadalcanal was used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The marauders rarely got into the kind of long-range, precision firefights that required a scoped rifle. Most of the fighting was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, chaotic firefights in dense jungle where you could barely see 30 feet in front of you. And during those 3 months in Burma, George had a realization. The Winchester Model 70 was a superb rifle, maybe the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But the face of modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles, like the Garand, were becoming the new standard. The next war, it was clear, would demand different weapons and entirely different tactics. But for George, there would be no next war. Not immediately, anyway. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma along with the rest of the marauders. The legendary unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties back in the United States, and he would never fire his Winchester in combat again. George arrived back in the States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and sent him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His new mission? To train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught them the brutal lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma. How to navigate dense jungle, how to spot and engage targets from afar, and how to operate deep behind enemy lines without a supply chain. He still had his Winchester Model 70. That rifle had journeyed from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma and now to Georgia. It had accounted for at least 14 confirmed enemy kills, though the real number was probably higher. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle now sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely even looked at it. The war itself had transformed. The Pacific Islands were being reclaimed, one by one. American forces were pushing through France, straight into Germany. The need for a lone marksman with his own private rifle was vanishing. The military was shifting to mass production, interchangeable parts, and soldiers with identical equipment and training. George understood why it had to be this way. Modern warfare required an industrial scale. But he felt something was being lost. That individual skill, the craftsman's approach to being a soldier, the very idea that one man with the right rifle and the right training could change the course of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January of 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. He went back to Illinois and used the GI Bill to enroll at Princeton University, studying politics and graduating with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 more in British East Africa, studying politics and local institutions. He finally settled in Washington, D.C., as the executive director of the Institute of African American Relations and later became a consultant on African affairs for the State Department. Through all those years, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. His colleagues knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they had no idea what happened at Point Cruz. They had no idea about the Japanese snipers he'd faced. They knew nothing of the Winchester Model 70 rifle that sat quietly in a case back at his home. In 1947, George decided to write it all down. Not for publication, but just for his own records. He wanted to capture the brutal reality of jungle warfare, the weapons, the tactics, while the memories were still sharp. For 6 months he wrote, and the manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and insisted it be published. George was reluctant. The book was highly technical, filled with detailed descriptions of rifles, ammunition, and ballistics. It wasn't exactly for the general reader, but the NRA convinced him. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, was published in 1947. It became an absolute classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. It described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and in Burma with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just the cold, hard facts about what worked and what didn't in combat. That book is still in print, still used as a reference by collectors and historians. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched military rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with its own dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009, at 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that took out those snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk right past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare.